How did a novelist who rarely left her small English village manage to capture the complexities of the human heart for over 200 years? The profound literary paradox of Jane Austen's life and work lies in the astonishing disproportion between the narrow geographical confines of her existence, rarely venturing beyond the genteel. Provincial borders of her small English village and the sprawling, universal scope of the truths she uncovered about human nature, societal pretension, and the complexities of the heart. A feat that allowed her meticulous, witty observations to remain acutely relevant and captivating to readers across more than 2 centuries. Her brilliance was not in traversing the globe, but in her capacity to distill the grand universal dramas of courtship, ambition, economic necessity, and moral integrity into the highly pressurized, small-scale world of the English country gentry, proving that the most intense human conflict is often found not in battlefields or foreign lands, but across the intimate space of a drawing-room floor. A call to action for the inquisitive mind if this deep dive into the life and enduring literary genius of Jane Austen has sparked your appreciation for the elegant construction of her world and the subtle power of her wit. Then we urge you to participate in fostering the intellectual community that sustains this analysis. We commit to producing meticulously researched and insightful content, but that mission depends entirely on your engaged support, therefore. Please take a moment to like this document or video to boost its visibility and reach new audiences. Click subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you never miss another piece of in-depth historical or literary analysis. And finally, please share this content with any friend, family member, or colleague who shares a similar love for classic literature and the enduring figures who shaped it, as your engagement is the critical engine that drives our continued creation of high-quality educational material. Born in 1775, Jane was the daughter of a rector. Her close-knit family, especially her sister Cassandra, fostered her wit and reading passion. Jane Austen entered the world in 1775 as the daughter of George Austen, a well-read and moderately prosperous parish rector in Steventon, Hampshire, an intellectual and social environment that provided an ideal incubator for her formidable talents. The family was unusually close-knit and encouraged a lively, often theatrical atmosphere of reading, debate, and performance, but the most profound influence was arguably her elder sister, Cassandra, who served as her lifelong confidant, her emotional anchor, and the first most critical audience for all her literary endeavors. A unique bond that shielded Jane's nascent wit and reading passion from the often stifling conventions of 18th century female education. The rectory was Jane's entire world for 25 years, a walled garden that supplied the characters, wit, and moral drama for all her books. For the entirety of her formative years and through the crucial period of her early creative development, the rectory in Steventon served as Jane's principal and most powerful social laboratory, her walled garden of experience where she remained for an unbroken 25 years. This secluded yet highly observant vantage point was the sole, indispensable source that provided her with the entirety of the raw materials she needed: the distinct characters, the refined wit, the nuanced social etiquette, and the subtle moral dramas that animate and define all of her immortal books, proving that a perceptive eye trained on a small community can extract more universal truth than a superficial gaze across vast landscapes. As a teenager, Austen wrote hilarious and highly satirical short pieces for her family, now collected as her juvenilia, displaying an astonishing precocity and an already fully developed sense of comedic timing. Jane spent her teenage years writing numerous hilarious and highly satirical short pieces that were intended exclusively for the amusement and performance of her immediate family circle. These early spirited and often anarchic compositions, which today lovingly collected as her juvenilia, offer a crucial glimpse into the origins of her famous style, demonstrating that her renowned irony and sharp observational skills were present from the very beginning, even as she gleefully flouted all established literary conventions for comic effect. Works like Love and Friendship openly mock the exaggerated sensibility of contemporary romantic novels filled with fainting heroines and wild coincidence. A perfect example of her early critical engagement is the novella Love and Friendship, a pivotal work within the juvenilia that openly and gleefully mocked the exaggerated sensibility, a highly fashionable sentimental literary movement of the period that dominated contemporary romantic novels. She mercilessly parodied the ridiculous over-the-top conventions, ridiculing narratives that were routinely filled with fainting heroines, impossibly melodramatic speeches, and utterly wild coincidences that propelled the plot, thereby signaling her early commitment to realism and her rejection of emotional dishonesty in literature. Jane's youthful flirtation with Tom Lefroy was intense but fleeting. They danced often at the Christmas balls of 1795 to 1796. The only documented significant romantic attachment in Jane's life was her intense, yet tragically fleeting youthful flirtation with Tom Lefroy, a charming, aspiring lawyer from Ireland who was visiting his relatives nearby. Their relationship reached its emotional peak during the festive Christmas balls of 1795 to 1796. Where they spent a great deal of time together on the dance floor, a setting that, in Austen's world, provided one of the few sanctioned opportunities for prolonged, intimate, and telling conversation between young men and women of the period. Jane confessed to Cassandra that she expected an offer, but neither had the necessary fortune to risk an impractical marriage. The emotional intensity of the brief connection with Lefroy was so pronounced that in one of her few surviving intimate letters, Jane confessed to her sister Cassandra that she fully expected an offer of marriage from him, a deeply serious and life-altering proposal in that era. However, this expectation was immediately tempered by the harsh, inescapable reality that neither of them possessed the necessary fortune or secure income that was legally and socially required. To risk an impractical marriage without a substantial economic foundation, which would have meant financial ruin and social censure for both families. Tom was hurried away by his family to London to pursue his legal career, ending the romance. Jane later said she was too proud to make any inquiries. The romantic episode was decisively and swiftly concluded when Tom Lefroy was urgently hurried away by his family to London, as they recognized the financial danger of the attachment and demanded he focus immediately on pursuing his legal career and securing a more lucrative and socially appropriate match. This abrupt and enforced separation effectively ended the romance, leaving Jane with a private wound, and she later reflected on the moment with her characteristic dignified reserve, noting that she was too proud to make any inquiries after him. It's an emotional stance that reveals the source of the proud, self-respecting heroines who populate her novels. Did you know Pride and Prejudice began as an 18th century work titled First Impressions, which was initially rejected outright by a publisher? It is a cornerstone fact of literary history that Pride and Prejudice, the novel that would eventually become her most beloved and enduring work, did not begin life with its iconic title, but started as a fully realized 18th century manuscript titled First Impressions, a focus that centered on the hasty, flawed initial judgments made by its characters. Furthermore, this earlier version, despite its obvious brilliance, holds the unique historical distinction of being initially rejected outright by a publisher, a humiliating early setback that could have easily derailed her entire literary career before it began. Austen drafted the novel when she was 21, and her father sent it to publisher Thomas Cadell in 1797. It was rejected by return mail. The initial creative burst for the novel was astonishingly early in her life, with Austen drafting the complete novel when she was merely 21 years old, a testament to her precocity. Seeing the potential, her supportive father, George Austen, took the bold, unusual step of acting as her agent, sending the complete manuscript to the major London publisher Thomas Cadell in November 1797, only to receive a disheartening and decisive rejection by return mail, the swiftness of the refusal indicating that the publisher likely did not even grant the work a serious full reading, a harsh early lesson in the capricious nature of the publishing business. The final title changed to Pride and Prejudice, emphasizing the journey of Elizabeth Bennet overcoming her own pride and prejudice. The eventual, crucial decision to change the novel's title from First Impressions to Pride and Prejudice represented a profound, mature shift in emphasis, elevating the work from a mere comedy of manners to a deep psychological study. The new title emphasized the internal moral and emotional journey that was required of the heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, who had to work to overcome both her own self-satisfied pride in her judgment of others and her deeply ingrained prejudice against this seemingly arrogant Mr. Darcy. A dual psychological flaw that provided the engine for the novel's entire moral architecture. The novel's Sense and Sensibility began as an earlier epistolary draft titled Eleanor and Marianne around 1795. Similarly, the novel's Sense and Sensibility, which was the first of her works to be formally published, also underwent a significant evolution from its earliest inception. The novel originated as an even earlier work written around 1795 that utilized the popular contemporary form of the epistolary draft, meaning the narrative was entirely conducted through a series of exchanged letters. And this initial version was aptly titled Eleanor and Marianne, reflecting its original, narrower focus on the individual experiences of the two distinct protagonists before its subsequent sweeping thematic revisions. The final title shifted the focus from characters to the universal conflict between reason Eleanor and excessive emotion Marianne. The brilliant, successful revision of the title to Sense and Sensibility strategically shifted the entire narrative's focus away from the specific personalities and individual fortunes of the two Dashwood sisters, Eleanor and Marianne, to the more powerful and universal philosophical conflict that their lives embodied. This conflict was the deep intellectual tension between reason, sense, which was personified by the restrained and pragmatic older sister Eleanor, and the dramatic, often dangerous appeal of excessive emotion sensibility, which was embodied by the impulsive and highly romantic younger sister Marianne. Austen was critiquing the 18th century literary cult of sensibility, arguing that while deep feeling was valuable, it needed to be tempered by common sense. In writing Sense and Sensibility, Austen was not merely telling a romantic story, but actively and shrewdly critiquing the pervasive 18th century literary cult of sensibility, a movement that glorified intense, often debilitating emotional display as a mark of virtue and refinement. Her central philosophical argument was a measured and modern one. While the capacity for deep, genuine feeling was absolutely valuable and necessary for a full human life, she definitively argued that it urgently needed to be tempered by common sense, rational control, and disciplined prudence to prevent profound personal tragedy and societal chaos. In 1801, the family abruptly moved to the fashionable city of Bath, an upheaval that tragically marked the beginning of Jane's silent period. In 1801, her father's sudden, unexpected decision to retire and relocate the entire family to the cosmopolitan, fashionable city of Bath constituted a massive and traumatic upheaval for the 25-year-old Jane, violently tearing her away from the security and creative solitude of the rectory. This dramatic, unwelcome change of environment, which shattered her settled routine, tragically marked the beginning of Jane's silent period, a dark, unproductive stretch of several years where her established prolific writing output almost entirely ceased. Her writing output plummeted, likely due to grief over leaving her childhood home, lack of space, and the distraction of an intense social life. During the unsettling years in Bath, Jane's literary writing output plummeted to almost zero, a creative void that literary historians attribute to several crushing factors. These included the profound grief over leaving her cherished childhood home and losing her established creative sanctuary, a persistent lack of private space in the crowded city lodgings where she could write in secret, and the draining constant distraction of an intense social life that the family's new fashionable location in Bath relentlessly demanded of them. After her father's death in 1805, the women were forced to live in temporary lodgings, causing years of instability and unfinished work, like the Watsons. The already unstable situation was rendered financially precarious by the tragic death of her father in 1805, leaving Jane, Cassandra, and her mother facing a sudden lack of secure income and necessitating them to live in temporary, often cramped lodgings supported by the charity of her brothers. This intense, prolonged financial and domestic instability lasted for years, proving devastating to her creativity and directly resulting in the abandonment of promising works. Most notably, the compelling, tantalizingly unfinished work, The Watsons. The family's moved to Chawton Cottage in 1809. Thanks to her wealthy brother Edward, finally restored the stability Jane needed to write. The essential turning point in Jane's life and career arrived in 1809 when her wealthy, beneficent elder brother, Edward Austen Knight, who had inherited a large estate, offered the women permanent rent-free residence in Chawton Cottage in a small village near Alton. This gracious act of familial support finally restored the crucial domestic and financial stability that Jane had desperately needed for almost a decade, effectively providing the serene, predictable, and supportive environment required for the resumption of her serious creative work. This cottage was her most productive home. She revised her early drafts and wrote Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion from scratch. Chawton Cottage was, without a doubt, the most significant and most productive home of Jane Austen's entire creative life, the place where she achieved the astonishing output that secured her literary immortality. Within its modest walls, she undertook the necessary, painstaking work of revising her early, decades-old drafts, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and, more impressively, wrote her three final masterpieces, Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion, entirely from scratch, effectively cementing her literary output in a final concentrated burst of genius. All four novels published in her lifetime, including Pride and Prejudice, appeared anonymously under the phrase "by a lady." A significant, enduring historical detail of Austen's professional life is that all four of the novels that were published during her own lifetime, including her most celebrated work, Pride and Prejudice, were released to the public anonymously. This decision meant that her works never bore her name, but instead appeared on the title page only under the discreet, socially acceptable, and intentionally vague phrase "by a lady," a deliberate strategy to shield her from the societal implications of being a professional woman writer. Publishing anonymously protected her reputation and allowed her to avoid the criticism often directed at women writers. The strategic choice to publish anonymously was not born out of false modesty, but was a practical measure primarily designed to protect her personal reputation and that of her family within the conservative gentry society of her time. This shield of anonymity effectively allowed her to avoid the often harsh, personalized, and often gendered criticism which frequently centered on the perceived impropriety of a woman seeking public recognition and financial gain from writing that was routinely and viciously directed at contemporary women writers who chose to openly pursue a professional literary career. Despite anonymity, her identity was a quiet, open secret within literary circles and even reached the Prince Regent, who requested a dedication. Although her name was absent from the published title pages, her identity was far from completely hidden, operating instead as a quiet, open secret within London's educated literary circles and among the societal elite who possessed the requisite connections. The extent of her quiet fame was definitively proven when news of her identity even reached the Prince Regent. George IV, a famously indulgent man who, admiring her novels, personally requested that she dedicate her forthcoming novel, Emma, to him, a political honor that placed Jane in a slightly uncomfortable but undeniable position of celebrity. Emma, 1815, is unique because Jane herself predicted her heroine's unlikability, stating, "A heroine whom no one but myself will much like." Her final novel, published during her life, Emma, 1815, holds a unique place in her canon, largely because Jane herself famously predicted her heroine's potential unlikability prior to its release, a moment of profound literary self-awareness. In a famous private letter, she confidently stated that she had intentionally created a heroine whom no one but myself will much like, acknowledging that Emma Woodhouse's privileged flaws were designed to challenge the reader's expectation of the traditional, morally perfect romantic lead. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, suffers from self-deception and constantly misreads social cues and romantic connections. The heroine, Emma Woodhouse, is introduced to the reader with an ironic flourish as handsome, clever, and rich, possessing every external advantage. Yet her internal character is deeply flawed. She severely suffers from self-deception due to her unchallenged privilege and lack of genuine hardship, a fatal flaw that leads her to constantly misread crucial social cues and mismanage romantic connections, her own and those of her friends, resulting in a comedy of errors that threatens to spiral into serious social and emotional damage for those around her. Austen perfected the unreliable narrator using free indirect discourse, allowing the reader to access Emma's thoughts while still seeing her mistakes. To execute this masterful portrait of self-deception, Austen perfected the technique of the unreliable narrator by subtly yet brilliantly employing the sophisticated literary tool known as free indirect discourse, FID. This narrative mode allowed the reader to access Emma's subjective thoughts and internal, mistaken logic directly, creating intimacy, while simultaneously permitting the narrator's detached, witty voice to hover just above the text, providing the reader with the necessary objective distance to clearly see and judge Emma's errors and mistakes as they unfolded. The core question in Austen's world was not if a woman married, but who and why, given the legal constraints of the era. In the highly constrained socioeconomic world depicted in Austen's novels, the core life-altering question facing her heroines was never the simple assurance of if a woman married. For most women of her class, marriage was a near certain, inevitable fate, but the far more complicated and weighty matter of who they chose to marry and the underlying why. This choice was given immense importance because of the severe legal and economic constraints of the era, which effectively stripped married women of their property rights and financial independence. For women like the Bennet sisters, marriage was the sole path to economic security and social status, often prioritizing financial necessity over affection. The stark, undeniable reality for young, property-less women like the Bennet sisters was that marriage was the sole, legally recognized path to achieving economic security, social status, and a respectable home. This existential requirement meant that the decision of whom to marry often necessitated a cold, pragmatic calculus, frequently prioritizing financial necessity, social standing, and long-term security for both herself and her family over the luxury of pure, unadulterated romantic affection, turning courtship into an extended economic negotiation. Austen satirized marriages purely for material gain, like Charlotte Lucas, but ultimately advocated for a union based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Austen was a keen observer of human motivation, and her writing Austen's subtle feminism was not confrontational, but rather demonstrated women's potential as rational, moral, and complex individuals, defining their own happiness. Austen's crucial contribution to female liberation can be defined as a subtle, intellectual feminism that strategically avoided the confrontational rhetoric of later movements. Instead, she used the highly polished tool of the novel to demonstrate women's immense potential as rational, discerning, moral, and complex individuals capable of making sound ethical judgments. Her goal was to show that women were capable of intelligently defining their own happiness through the power of discerning choice and refined moral perception, rather than passively accepting the preordained fates dictated by patriarchal society. The creation of her final completed novel, Persuasion, overlapped with the onset of her mysterious, debilitating illness in 1816. A profound sense of poignancy hangs over the creative period of her final completed novel. Persuasion, a novel suffused with themes of loss, second chances, and autumnal reflection. Its creation, from initial draft to final completion, tragically overlapped directly with the sudden, mysterious, and profoundly debilitating onset of her final illness in 1816. A period where her literary genius was burning brightly, even as her physical health began its rapid, irreversible decline toward a tragic early death. Her health rapidly declined due to what many modern experts believe was Addison's disease, an adrenal insufficiency. Following the onset of her sickness in 1816, Jane's physical health rapidly and visibly declined, a process marked by severe back pain, weakness, skin discoloration, and chronic fever, though the exact cause remained a medical mystery during her life. Many modern medical experts and historical researchers believe with strong conviction that her symptoms were highly consistent with Addison's disease, a then untreatable, life-threatening chronic condition caused by the insufficient production of hormones by the adrenal glands. She moved to Winchester for treatment but died there on July 18, 1817. At the age of 41, leaving the fragment Sanditon unfinished. In her final weeks, in a desperate last-ditch attempt to find a cure, or at least relief, she was moved from Chawton to the city of Winchester to receive specialized medical treatment from a respected physician. However, the illness was too advanced, and she sadly died there on July 18, 1817. At the tragically young age of 41, leaving behind a final, witty, and intriguing literary fragment, the lively, observational, seaside novel Sanditon, which remained unfinished at the moment of her death. Jane's death was a crushing blow to Cassandra, who sadly burned many of her sister's private letters to protect her memory. The loss of Jane was a devastating, crushing personal blow to her beloved elder sister and closest confidant, Cassandra, who was left to mourn the person who was arguably the single most important human being in her life. In the immediate aftermath of Jane's death, driven by an understandable, fierce sense of protective grief, Cassandra made the controversial, historically tragic decision to sadly burn many of her sister's private, intimate letters, a decisive act intended to protect Jane's highly guarded reputation and fiercely private memory from the inevitable scrutiny of a curious public. Later that year, her brother Henry Austen finally oversaw the publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion as a joint set. In a poignant act of posthumous devotion, later that same year, her dedicated brother Henry Austen, who had often served as her informal London agent and literary contact, took the necessary steps to finally oversee the publication of her two remaining previously unpublished manuscripts. These two novels, the early satire Northanger Abbey and the final reflection Persuasion, were released to the public as a carefully presented joint set, formally concluding her published works. Henry included a biographical notice publicly revealing Jane as the author of all 6 novels for the first time. The publication of the joint set holds immense historical significance because Henry Austen included a carefully written, crucial document called the biographical notice within the front matter of the volume. This public formal notice served the historic function of publicly revealing Jane Austen as the true singular author of all 6 novels, including the 4 that had been previously published under the veil of anonymity for the very first time, securing her rightful place in the English literary canon under her own name. Over 2 centuries later, Austen mania continues globally, driven by her timeless themes of wit, family, and finding happiness amidst social chaos. More than 2 centuries later, the enduring phenomenon of Austenmania, the global, passionate devotion to her works, shows no signs of abatement. This massive, continuing popularity is fundamentally driven by her timeless themes that speak across eras, particularly her brilliant use of wit, her meticulous, affectionate portrayal of family dynamics, and the universal, deeply relatable quest for individuals to find personal happiness and moral clarity amidst the often rigid, frustrating, and unavoidable constraints of complex social chaos. The 1990s was the peak of this craze, with 4 iconic adaptations released in 1995 alone, including the BBC's Pride and Prejudice, the modern resurgence of Jane Austen. As popularity reached its cultural zenith and definitive peak in the 1990s, a decade that witnessed an explosion of successful film and television adaptations. The apex of this craze occurred in the single astonishing year of 1995, which saw the release of 4 iconic, culturally significant adaptations alone, most notably the definitive, highly popular BBC's Pride and Prejudice miniseries starring Colin Firth, which captivated a massive global audience and cemented her pop culture relevance. Her most surprising legacy is the modern retelling, like the 1995 teen comedy Clueless, which perfectly updates Emma's storyline to Beverly Hills. Perhaps her most unexpected creative and enduring literary legacy is the consistent, sometimes subversive success of the modern retelling, proving the raw adaptability of her plots and character arcs to any era. A perfect example is the highly successful 1995 teen comedy Clueless, which brilliantly and masterfully updates the core storyline, sophisticated psychological themes, and moral framework of Emma the pampered, misguided heroine who believes she knows best to the radically different but equally rigid world of 20th century Beverly Hills, showcasing her timeless relevance to high school drama.